Good morning. Happy Friday, friends. We've made it through another week, and it was a big week. And next week's going to be a big week, and we're going to talk all about it today. So first, I want to start by celebrating some of the work that all of you have been doing. We're going to talk about this throughout the presentation today, but every action that you and people you know are taking is the reason that we are in the position that we are in. The debate and the reconciliation process that will lead to potential Medicaid cuts is stalled and delayed. And the reason is because people are concerned about Medicaid, people meaning lawmakers. So all of the work that you guys have been doing since January has bought more time, and we'll talk about how we can use that time. And this week we've been hearing from some of you. We really appreciate when you tell us, things that you're learning as you're talking with lawmakers or people in your lives that you know who you may assume know that Medicaid cuts are going on, but maybe don't. And some of that is going to be reflected in today's presentation. So it's really helpful when you give us feedback, because chances are that what you're hearing, you're not the only one, and we want to help prepare everybody to be able to kind of pivot and make changes that will lead to better outcomes for us all. So we did hear from some folks who were participating in Disability Advocacy Day this week. Many of you may have been there. It was a good virtual event. Heard lots of people had really positive meeting with state lawmakers. And one person said, my state lawmaker tried to tell me the message about there weren't any, Medicaid wasn't mentioned in the budget resolution, and I was able to use the information that you provided us and tell him that that wasn't true, that Medicaid cuts were in fact going to have to be part of it. And they pulled out their congressional budget office said nope, you're not correct on that. And it was a good reminder that the power of an informed constituent can actually make a big difference to a lawmaker who's trying to say something that is really not true. So that I think that there are lots of folks who are, engaging with lawmakers and talking to them very directly. And we know that there are a lot of folks across the state who are planning to visit their congressmen's in district offices and have been setting up meetings and press events for next week. So I just want to recognize all of the work that you guys have been doing, even though you may not see it as an individual. Collectively, you have been doing a lot, and it shows. So I'm going to start this presentation by talking about two things that are happening at the same time. And you may have heard more about a continuing resolution this week in the news than the budget reconciliation bill. We're going to talk about both. They are totally separate paths, but they do have some relationship to each other. Now, the continuing resolution is really Congress has not been able to pass a budget to keep the government that we have now operating. So a continuing resolution is best thought of as, what money do you need to keep doing the things that you are doing right now in this moment? And to give some context, Congress hasn't been able to go through its full budget appropriation process. It has only passed a budget on time 4 times since 1974. The last time we saw Congress actually pass a budget through the process it's supposed to use is 1997. And even then, 3 out of those 4 times, Congress was late. So we have been in the situation more often than not where Congress has to keep deciding what, to kind of kick the can down the road And a continuing resolution is the way that they do that. The continuing resolution becomes the way that you say, yes, we're going to keep funding, things as they are. And sometimes the continuing resolution can have adjustments in it, like cuts or increases to certain budget lines. And it's become kind of the standard way for Congress to create various moments of potential crisis, because if they don't act and they don't haven't approved money to continue doing what the government does, then the government shuts down. In other words, parts of the government just cease to operate because they don't have the money to do so. And you end up in a government shutdown, which has happened 5 times since 1995, the most recent in 2018. During a shutdown, in past shutdowns, Medicaid and Social Security have been considered essential functions and have continued regardless of whether Congress has passed the continuing resolution or not. But in a shutdown, there are lots of government employees who are considered non-essential, and their work stops. So it does have, if a shutdown happens, it does have a big impact on how things run, especially because states receive lots of money from the federal government to do a whole variety of things. And sometimes that money comes to the state, so state employees can do work. Sometimes that money comes to the state and then is distributed to counties or even to nonprofits who are receiving that money to do work. So if that money stops, there are lots and lots of other things that stop, both at the federal level and at the state and local level, because the money that is used to pay for the people who do that work isn't coming into the state. So it's important. All right. We are on the day where Congress must act and pass a continuing resolution, or the government will shut down. The House, originally, Congress was saying we will do a clean bill. What does a clean bill mean? A clean bill means that the continuing resolution is exactly what the current budget is. So there's no changes. That's what it means. The bill that passed the House, the continuing resolution that passed the House, was not clean. It was unclean. It had some cuts in the bill and some spending increases, about $13 billion in cuts, and then $9 billion that were in increases. So that has created a situation where people who were willing to support a bill with no changes are now saying, but this isn't a bill with no changes, and it has a lot of spending cuts that nobody has talked about. And it has spending increases that no one's talked about. And every Democrat in the House, except for one, voted against that because there were changes. Now it is in the Senate. And if the Senate approves the continuing resolution that has all of the changes, then we won't have a government shutdown, but there will be cuts that are made in the continuing resolution. Okay, that's one thing that's going on. And we will know before midnight tonight whether or not the Senate has agreed to keep funding the government and is accepting the cuts that they didn't agree to in the continuing resolution or not. The budget reconciliation bill is best thought of as decisions about future spending, future funding cuts and spending increases. This is a completely separate process. It's what we've been focused on when it comes to where are you going to try and make Medicaid cuts. The reason these two things are related is that if you have the federal government shut down and there's some question about, what things are operating, it becomes harder to do the work on the budget reconciliation bill. And the other piece is, if there are cuts in the continuing resolution bill, it really changes where the starting point is when you start talking about making additional cuts or spending increases. So these two things are related politically, but there's also a relationship between them, because whatever the current budget of the federal government is after the continuing resolution passes, that becomes the starting point for where the budget reconciliation bill is making cuts. Okay. And remember, the budget reconciliation bill, the House has already passed the outline of how much cuts do we need to make and what committees are being asked to make cuts. So any changes to the base of the government budget that it's starting with means that you're starting cuts from a lower place than you would be before. Okay. And as you know, the House, the reconciliation bill, the level of cuts that they have committed to in the House is $2 trillion in cuts, including at least $880 billion from the committee that oversees Medicaid. If you've attended webinars before, this is a little bit of a recap. We're now continuing on the budget reconciliation bill. It is conclusive that major Medicaid cuts are the only way that you get to $880 billion in the committee that has been assigned those cuts. And the other piece of information is, we've been talking about multiple ideas that have been floated and been being discussed by Congress. They've been written in print for the budget committee to think about, and have been covered in the mainstream press for the last 6 weeks and longer. There are multiple Medicaid ideas on how to cut Medicaid. And the other thing to know is that $880 billion in cuts, doing only one of those Medicaid cut ideas isn't enough. It doesn't get you to that big number. So it really means that Congress has to do several ideas, and all of those cut ideas, except for one, directly impact Wisconsin. So here's the good news. The House approved that budget resolution, $2 trillion in cuts, at least $880 billion for Medicaid, on February 25th, which is now kind of a long time ago. And they're still on step one. So even though they've passed a budget resolution, they now have to go through a lot of steps and a lot of work, and they haven't made much progress on it. There hasn't been any public release of what are the ideas or any committee hearings. Multiple committees were assigned, amounts to cut from the things that they oversee. We haven't seen any of those committees hold hearings yet. There hasn't been any public release of what cuts they're making. We're still on step one here. And look at how much other things have to happen before it even gets to the Senate. That delay is a sign that there is disagreement about what to do. They've had agreement about, we want to make big cuts, and they agreed to the level of cuts of each committee. And now you've got a bunch of lawmakers who are sitting there going, these are pretty deep cuts, and they have impact. And we're not sure that the cuts that we will make will be popular. And so they're kind of hovering in that first step. That's good news for advocates, because it's pretty clear that the real disagreement is about the cuts to Medicaid. And that is all due to the work of people like you, who have been raising your hands and saying, wait a minute, if you cut that amount of money to Medicaid, that means there's a lot less money coming to states, which means states have to make decisions, and they're going to have to make decisions about whether to increase funding a lot to keep things the same, or more likely, they're going to have to make some decisions about changing their Medicaid programs to fit the amount of money that they want to spend. And the only way they can make changes is to decide who can or can't be in Medicaid, what Medicaid does or doesn't cover, and how much to pay the people who provide health and long-term care services to people who are in Medicaid. So that seems like a group of decisions that isn't that good for state residents. And one thing I want to highlight here, in the House, the person that is pictured there is Representative Chip Roy. He is a leader in the House Conservative Fiscal Caucus. And it's really fascinating because he actually had to go on Fox News and try and make a public pitch to convince his Republican colleagues in the House not to worry about cutting Medicaid, that this was the moment. This was the time to make huge, deep cuts to Medicaid, and they should line up and be willing to do so. And what I see as an observer here is that when you have to make that kind of argument in public, it means it's not going well in private. It means that behind the scenes, there are quite a few members of the Republican caucus who are maybe not really interested in making deep cuts to Medicaid that constituents will figure out might affect, their health or long-term care. And having to say something in public really telegraphs that the argument isn't being settled behind closed doors, which is a great sign for advocates, because it means that what you are saying is working, in the sense that it is giving lawmakers pause. On the Senate side, there's also some interesting stuff remember, in January, we were told this was all going to be over by the end of February, and now we're in the middle of March. And the Senate, which always wanted to do two separate reconciliation bills, but has kind of said, okay, if the House passed one bill that does all the things, then we maybe could think about that. They're doing something interesting too. They're saying publicly, we're not even going to get to step one where the House is, because the Senate has to pass the exact same language as the House. And they're saying, we're not going to bring the budget resolution the House passed to our Senate members to agree to for several weeks. That's interesting, because that means they're delaying even thinking about starting this process in the Senate. And to me, that means they're delaying it because they don't have the votes to pass that resolution yet, and possibly because they're waiting to see what those House committees are going to decide when it comes to how they're going to make the cuts that are assigned to their committee. There's also been some chatter in the press about the Senate holding on to their two-bill approach. So this is kind of like a giant game of slow-moving chicken. And, the constituents are kind of, you're the cars, you're creating the delay, and then these two bodies are trying to figure out, can we do what we thought we were going to do or not? Maybe you should go first, and I'll see how constituents react to your plan, because if they react badly, maybe our plan can change and be different and be more appealing to constituents. All of this is pretty good news for us, because if the Senate is not even going to start their process until a month from now, that gives us time to see if the House is able to make any progress and really make some comments if we get a very clear picture of what their ideas are. But it also means that we could be in a position where we keep having new things to say and new things to do that continue to make Medicaid cuts really, really unappealing. So, just big picture, kind of a timeline. I talked about the House passed its budget resolution, outlined $2 trillion in cuts and at least $880 billion from Medicaid. They passed that February 25th. We are now on March 14th. On March 5th, we got confirmation that yes, what they passed in the 25th really does mean Medicaid cuts. We're on March 14th. Either the government is going to shut down or there's going to be a continuing resolution passed. Next week, our members of Congress, both our US senators and our congressional reps, are going to be back in Wisconsin and in town, which is a great time to talk to them. And then the original timeline the speaker had was the week after in district would be when those committees would be making some decisions and publicly doing some decision making about what the cuts are that their committees were assigned. I don't think he's going to make that date because the committees haven't had any hearings or made any indication of what ideas they're considering. But that was his original timeline. So next week becomes really important because it means that constituents can be really influential in determining, how fast this process goes. And then we start getting into when things become less clear. All of this is pretty good news for us. Delay is opportunity. You have more time to add more voices to the conversation, to find more people who are concerned about Medicaid for different reasons, who can get courage enough to take some small actions and maybe more actions to communicate, with lawmakers and with other people that they know that Medicaid cuts are on the table and that they are not going to be good for Wisconsin's economy or businesses or people. It's more time to have more information and be better prepared on, messaging that is going to be effective. It's also more time to, engage with the press and other places, to do interviews, to do podcasts, to do social media posts, to get articles that could also be shared, more time to kind of build the momentum and the information that you can distribute so more and more people understand and continue to understand that this is an issue that's important and it's not going away. Delay is also a strategy on the part of lawmakers. You're in a testing period now. There were lots and lots of people especially in February and early March, who were really concerned about Medicaid cuts, and they saw things happening, right? They saw that the House was passing a budget resolution. They saw that there was a lot of coverage of Medicaid cuts. And now that there is this period, this lull period where there isn't as much action, very deliberately, right? Because, not being public about your ideas or what you're doing is a way to kind of tamp down the number of eyes that are watching. This is a period where we're being tested to see whether we're going to continue to talk about Medicaid cuts and see if it's going to continue to be an issue lawmakers hear about, or is this going to die down and go away? And maybe that looks like permission, that people aren't as engaged or concerned and they're not checking up on us, and that maybe we can kind of do what we want to do and move forward some cuts without people noticing. It's really hard to respond to anything when you're not being given any information. But that doesn't mean that you can't be the person who's doing the talking and providing information that they should be responding to. The longer this goes, the harder it is for people to stay engaged. You get tired, there's other things that come up, you get discouraged. Don't do that, because all of the work that you have done has resulted in a place where they think they have to stop and then you'll go away. And if you stop talking, then your silence looks like permission. And it's not. The thing I want folks to understand who have been attending these webinars, sometimes I don't think that our community gives itself enough credit. We are the experts on this. You are the base of people who really is tapped into knowing what's going on. You're part of a group who is already very engaged and active on this, and you need to understand that not everybody is like you. Even people who use Medicaid or who are paid Medicaid dollars may not understand these cuts are coming. So I want you to lean into yourselves and understand that you are the experts, not only in your own lives and what Medicaid means to you and what would happen if you have less help than you are now. Your lived experience is expertise. It is something that these lawmakers who are making decisions about these programs do not have. And it's extremely important. You are the person who can say, if this happens, then this is the result. And that's what they need to hear. So think of yourselves now as ambassadors, as people who really do have a lot of expertise and ability and are teachers. And think of yourself as a constant teacher, not only to lawmakers, but to everybody around you who, may not understand that these cuts are going to impact them. Most people are going to rely on Medicaid at some point in their life. There is some amazing statistic that 9 out of 10 people will be touched by Medicaid over the course of their lifetimes. And it's easy to see how that statistic arrives when you have 40% of people who are born in this country, that birth is being supported by Medicaid. It is easy to see that when by circumstance of birth or accident or aging, people acquire disabilities. Most of us will if we are lucky to live long enough. And that many of the places that people with disabilities are able to get their health and long-term care needs met is Medicaid. And of course, if we live long enough and need long-term care services, even if we have quite a bit of money and are able to pay a nursing home at the private pay rate, eventually that money goes away. We don't have any of it left. And then Medicaid becomes the primary payer of long-term care for nursing home services. So when you think about that, think about yourselves as being a real expert and a teacher to people who may not understand that they have already been touched by Medicaid or will be in the future, and that there's a lot of value in making sure that those supports that you rely on now are available for them when they need it. So you may feel like a broken record. Remember, you're the base. This time that we have, this delay, we can use to expand the base of people. You're not alone right now. There are thousands of people like you, but wouldn't it be great to have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or 1 million people who in this state are all dialed in and knowing what's going on and are saying what you're saying? It would be great. So you may feel like you have said these things before, but you got to say it. You got to say it again. You got to keep saying it. You are repeating yourself, but for somebody else, it's the first time they're hearing it. And I think that in this age where now people do not get their information from the same places, and you can really decide where you're getting your information and kind of not, go to certain mediums, it's harder and harder for the general public to kind of all have a common understanding of big things that may matter to them. We know from, if you're a parent or an advertiser, you can ask yourself the question, how many times do I have to repeat something before it's heard once? I'm asking that myself because I have 2 kids right now who are little. Repetition matters. Most people need to hear something between 5 and 7 times before it sinks in, before they're ready to do some action. And it matters that not only to say the same thing, it matters that you're saying a similar message. It's not necessarily the same words. It's reinforcing that Medicaid matters to you personally, to your family, to unpaid caregivers, to workers. You can talk about Medicaid in a whole variety of ways because it is a big deal and it does impact people a lot of different ways. And it's important to do that communication in a variety of mediums, which many of you already do. Many of you have already done something like talk to somebody in person about Medicaid. Might have been your lawmaker or staff person or even a friend. In person matters. It matters that you contacted the press. It matters that you emailed. It matters that you made a phone call. It matters that you posted on TikTok or any of the other social media platforms. These are all ways that you create a bigger and bigger footprint that is all about the same topic. And it makes it more likely that the message that Medicaid cuts are coming and they are not going to be good for people is heard by more and more people. It's how we learn, all of us. So we should use that when we're thinking about things we really care about and just make that a part of our practice. This is how people are going to learn that they might be impacted by Medicaid cuts. Now, some of these next 2 slides are coming directly from people like you who have followed up with us. Somewhat surprised, because again, you are the experts. You're now the base of people who's really dialed into what's going on. And some of you have expressed surprise that people who are in a Medicaid program don't know that their program is paid for by Medicaid. In fact, some people have reported people they're interacting with saying, well, that won't matter to me because, I'm in family care and that's a state program. Well, family care is funded by Medicaid and 60% of the funding comes from the federal government in Medicaid funds, but people don't necessarily understand that. So, one of the messages, and we know this because it happened in 2017 and 2018 as well, when we had this fight with Congress. People don't know that the programs and the services that they're familiar with are actually funded by Medicaid because they have a different name. So, Forward Health Card, Medicaid, school-based Medicaid and mental health services, Medicaid, family care, IRIS, CLTS, Medicaid, making that connection for people, making sure that they understand that that's a Medicaid funded program and 60% of the funding is at risk because that's how much the federal government pays for those programs and services, is an important connection. It is something that many people who are in these programs who would be potentially directly impacted don't know they'd be impacted because the name is different than Medicaid. It is also true that, and this is coming from, somebody who followed up with us who is a provider, they run a small business that provides a particular service through family care. And they were talking with some of their other colleagues from other providers. And we're surprised to find that providers they knew who were fully funded by Medicaid for a specific service didn't seem to understand that federal Medicaid cuts were a danger to their business. So it's not only the people who are in the programs who may not have made the connection fully that this thing that's going on at the federal level may directly impact the services that they receive every day. These are businesses who provide Medicaid funded services who didn't seem to understand the source of the money that was paying them to do that work and pay their workers to do that work. So if you're a provider or you're an Iris consulting agency or a managed care organization, the things that you are contracted to do under family care, Iris, CLTS, Katie Beckett, those things are paid for by Medicaid, and federal dollars account for 60% of the funding, okay? So you may need to work with some of your colleagues to help them understand where their money comes from, and what is potentially at risk. I have some things up on here. Sometimes we have specific like billing codes, right? Residential services, day services, pre-vocational services, those are all totally funded by Medicaid dollars, nothing else. And if you are a person that contracts and does work for these programs, that is where the money is coming from. I also think that sometimes there are larger entities that may think, well, if cuts happen, we'll just, we're not engaged in preventing cuts. I think that's the wrong message because, if you're a consultant, an Iris consultant, or a care manager in family care, maybe your larger company says, well, we'll serve however many people that they're planning to serve. And if that means we need fewer workers, that's what means we need fewer workers. That's making a big assumption that the contract the state has with those entities to provide long-term care services stays the same. So I think it's really worthwhile if you work for an entity that doesn't seem that concerned about Medicaid cuts, you ask them why. You ask them what their plan is, if the contract changes, or if they need, or if the number of people that they serve changes, because it may be that there are quite a few jobs that they would lose, and a lot less money if Medicaid is serving fewer people, right? So there's a lot of room to grow our base here is the major message. There are tons and tons of people that who don't realize that these cuts are directly affecting them, and a lot of people who could become part of the base on Medicaid if they're invited, if they know what's going on, if they have tangible action steps that they can take, and we need them. We need a lot more voices, and a lot more voices from different perspectives, professionals who provide, different kinds of services for people in Medicaid, mental health services, therapies. These are all people who may not realize that their professional, the funding stream that is paying for the work they do is dependent on Medicaid. The other good sign this week is that lawmakers are changing their messaging to constituents. What we were hearing as messages in maybe early February is different than what we're hearing now. There's some things that are saying the same thing, but overall, we have seen a shift for how lawmakers are talking about Medicaid and trying to portray Medicaid cuts. That's also a good sign. It may be frustrating to you because you've kind of heard them say some things and you've responded, and now they're saying different things. But the fact they're saying different things means that what they were saying isn't working anymore. So they've got to try and find something different to say and see if that works better with constituents. They're responding to you. And part of this long game is that they respond, and then you respond, and then they have another response, and then you have to have another response. It's like that game of tennis, right? You keep hitting the ball back and forth over the net, and eventually somebody misses the ball and they get a point. We're not going to be the ones that miss the ball, okay? One thing that we have gotten some really clear feedback on is that the message about the overall economic impact of Medicaid to the state really made a difference. That was a real big shift in how lawmakers were thinking about Medicaid. When they saw that map that you saw a few weeks ago that showed exactly how many people in every county were in Medicaid, it showed how many businesses, almost 40,000, received Medicaid funding. It showed how much money went into each county that was from Medicaid. That made a really big difference for lawmakers because it made it very clear that the impact of Medicaid was pretty broad. Not only the 1.2 million people in Medicaid, but everybody who gets paid to provide those services. So we know that economic messages are really resonating. And you have an economic message that perhaps we haven't talked about as much, but it's worth thinking about now. Many people with disabilities are workers, and they are contributing to the economy, not only because of what they do for their employers, but also the taxes that they pay. When you are a worker, you pay income tax, and you pay into Medicare, and you pay into Social Security and other things. So there is a case to be made that if somebody supports change and they're no longer able to do things that they're doing now, that has an economic cost, not only to the individual, but to the employer and also to the greater economy, okay? There are also, in addition to people with disabilities who are working themselves, most people with disabilities really rely on unpaid caregivers for at least part or even most of their care. And this unpaid caregiver group is really big, and they provide the majority of the care, even for people who are in Medicaid and receive some amount of paid supports. All the other time that they're not receiving paid supports is likely to be supported by unpaid family caregivers. So Survival Coalition did a survey a couple of years ago. I think it's still relevant in 2025 because it really confirms what we already knew, that family caregivers are providing a lot of care for a long time, and that it has a real impact on their ability to participate in the workforce. So another economic impact for unpaid caregivers to think about is, have you left the workforce entirely? Have you had to reduce your work hours, go part-time? Are you in the same job when you could have been doing something more that paid more if you weren't having to organize your work world around whether or not you can provide care? These are all economic costs, and they haven't necessarily been clearly said by people, but I think it's time to start doing that, okay? It does cost you as an individual when you can't work to your full earning potential, or you go part-time, or you leave the workforce. You know what your salary was and what it isn't when you aren't working. It matters because, when somebody reduces income or leaves the workforce, it changes the whole family budget. It changes what you are able to do or afford. It changes whether or not somebody has employer-sponsored health insurance, how much they're paying in to Social Security and Medicaid as or Medicare as an individual. It changes how much you pay in income taxes. These are all quantifiable things that people just like you can think about and quantify and make it to a message for lawmakers. When I have to reduce my hours, when I have to leave my job, this is what it means for us. There's an impact to employers too. I've been in the policy game for a long time, and for the last 2 or 3 legislative sessions, absolutely everybody and their uncle has talked about workforce shortages. It's in every field. It is not one place where there is a shortage of qualified workers to do all sorts of jobs. So there's a real case to be made that if you are an unpaid caregiver who is having to figure out whether or not they can participate in the workforce and how much, you are taking away a qualified person who would be able to contribute more, but because we're not, doing things where that family member can fully work, they're forced to make different decisions. How is this related to Medicaid cuts? Well, for most unpaid family care members, if their person is in Medicaid, they are already supplementing a system that doesn't provide enough help. If that system provides even less help, the pressure on family caregivers to leave the workforce or reduce hours becomes greater. And in fact, that's a lot of what's happening, especially with older adults and with people who are the so-called sandwich generation, where they're taking care of older parents and young kids or an adult with a disability at the same time. So try and think about some of this stuff in terms of what expertise is the community and your employer and the overall workforce losing if they lose you. And a way to think about it, this is kind of sort of a worksheet. A way to think about it is, okay, what does it mean to me as an individual? Reduce my income. How does it change my budget? What does it mean to my ability to comfortably retire? I am losing, contributing into programs that would supplement my income when I'm not working as an older adult. What does it mean to your health insurance? These are the kinds of things that you can kind of sit at the kitchen table and go, okay, let's think about what it would mean if I had to do these things because Medicaid was cut and I have to do even more than I am today. I think it's important also to lean into what is your experience and your skills that are lost to Wisconsin. And I have personally talked with a number of people who have said, you know what, I'm a teacher, I'm a trained teacher, and I had to leave the workforce to take care of my older adult, my mom, or my child with a disability. And what that has meant is I left teaching 20 years before I thought I would, which means there are 22 kids per year for the next 10 years who didn't have a qualified teacher in a field that has a big shortage of workers. Like, that's a way to think about and explain the impact of what it means when somebody leaves the workforce. And there are a whole bunch of, jobs that are really highly skilled. Dental technicians, people, mechanics, like lead inspectors, name a field that requires somebody who needs to know what they're doing. And you can, which is all of us, by the way, you can start to explain what it means when that person who could be in the workforce is not able to be so. This is also a national story. For as much as we have heard about the caregiver shortage and crisis and know the current impact in the current system, it's affecting every place in the state. So you can, or in the country. So you can see if more and more people start thinking and messaging like, look, I don't have enough help now, and this is the impact now. If I get less help and I have to leave the workforce or reduce my hours, you can see that the impact just ramps up from a crisis point now. You don't have to know all of these statistics. I just put them on a slide because I like pictures, and also because I think it is important for people to understand that there are other people who are looking at the strain on unpaid caregivers and seeing it as an economic problem. Most of the statistics that are coming here are actually from banking and employer-sponsored, employer-focused groups. They're looking at what does it cost us when we have a care system that is so inadequate that they can't work like we expect them to because they have to do this other work that is unpaid. I'm not going to spend too much time on the next few slides, but I included them as an example. Next week, we're going to start doing a little more work on some of the rhetoric that we've been hearing from lawmakers that keeps getting repeated. I don't believe that this fight's going to be one on facts. It's going to be one on messaging, okay? And so one of the ideas that we've been hearing about is work requirements. That's how it's phrased in the news. Work requirements as a way to save money in Medicaid, right? It's a Medicaid cut, but we're hiding that behind the term work requirements. And all I want to show you in these slides is that not only is, what does that word phrase hide, but also the need to make sure that we are talking about these ideas in terms of what they actually are, as opposed to reinforcing a narrative that a politician might use because they want to justify that approach to a cut. So we've talked a lot about how you're already doing unpaid work and what it would mean if you left the workforce. And there's kind of this narrative out there that we should impose work requirements on people who are in Medicaid. That makes a couple of assumptions. It makes the assumption that people in Medicaid aren't working, which is absolutely untrue. We can say that almost 2/3 of adults in Wisconsin on Medicaid are working. And many of the people who aren't working in Medicaid, it's because they're providing caregiving duties, right? So that idea that work requirements should be a requirement for people in Medicaid really is making some assumptions, and it's trying to appeal to a belief system that somehow people in Medicaid aren't doing the same things that everybody else is. Couple of nice little images here. You can see how many people are working full or part-time, and 12% of people in Medicaid aren't working because they're caregiving. I would say they are working, they're just not getting paid to do that. You have people who are in Medicaid who are ill or who are sick and aren't able to work because of that. Like, that's a real thing. There are people who have cancer and other serious illnesses where Medicaid is the provider of their health care. So putting work requirements on in that population of people seems to be not really in keeping with what's going on in their real lives. You can see that there's a number of older adults who are maybe not 65 yet, but are over 60. They're in Medicaid too. There are people who have disabilities who are working, right? We have almost 40% of the people in Medicaid with a disability who are working. That this is all a long way of saying, when you say we should put work requirements on people in Medicaid, the response is they're already working, right? So why do you want to put requirements on people who are already working? Well, the reason this is on the menu of Medicaid cuts is that, and the Congressional Budget Office says, well, if you implement work requirements, we think it'll save you $109 billion over 10 years. The reason why work requirements end up saving money is because eligible people lose coverage or struggle to get in. So when you hear work requirements, it isn't a work requirement, it's prove you're working. You are already working, but now you have to prove it. And there's an administrative process that will probably require documentation. It will require you to act by a certain time. It will require you to know how to do certain things. You ask lots of more people to do administrative tasks at the same time. It is a recipe for mistakes, either by individuals or the agencies that now have to check these things, that have to, make sure the work requirements are going. That's how work requirements save money. And it isn't a work requirement. It's proving that you're already working, which people who have private insurance don't have to do, right? So we could go through all the reasons why it's difficult that these administrative requirements become a barrier. But I think for our purposes, what's important to know is the requirements piece of that two-word phrase really means extra paperwork to prove people are already doing what they're doing now. And the purpose of the paperwork requirement is to trip enough people off where you save money because they lose their care, okay? The only state to implement these prove you're working requirements before they were told to stop in 2019, 18,000 people lost their healthcare coverage because they couldn't figure out, or it was so hard to complete the paperwork. The other piece is when you hear the word requirement, it means somebody has to do something, and they probably have to do something that they're not doing now, right? So requirement means you have to have a process, you have to have a certain amount of space. There's new costs to states, and those costs aren't paid for, right? It's also true that there isn't a group of people in Medicaid who is not working, who is going to be somehow come magically into the workforce. This idea that there's a whole group of people who, if they just had the right incentives, or you make it harder, they'd work more and work themselves off Medicaid. That is not really true. What is true is that people who are already working lose their health care. There is some talk of exemptions. You just have to prove you're exempt. So the same idea of requirements gets applied whether or not you are working. You still have to work to prove that you are either working or exempt. Just a little example of like how the rhetoric works. And we're going to be working, in the next few weeks to help folks, draw a line again to connect the dots for lawmakers. So next week, lawmakers are at home. And if you were at last week's webinar, we had some ideas about, how do you organize yourself to do a visit? We think that, the idea of many people attending a town hall or trying to get a meeting at the same time, that was done in February, and we can see that lawmakers have shifted their approach. They're now in a place where they don't want to hold town hall, like in-person town halls. Some of them have done tele-town halls where they screen who they send the invite to, and they screen the questions. And all with an effort to try and get only people who they think will say things that are supportive of them to be the ones that talk. So I think that a different strategy this time when they're in district is to have a couple people at a time, no more than 3 or 4, going to in-district offices and going to talk about Medicaid. And the idea is to create kind of a constant wave of groups of people who are all kind of coming in at some regular cycle, and they're all talking about the same topics. You can call first. You say you'd like to stop in. If you don't get a response, go anyway, and come prepared. This time, make sure that you're bringing with you a copy of your Medicaid story, what you want to say. Maybe it's some news thing. Maybe it's some of the economic pieces that we talked about today. Write it down. Take some time. Doesn't have to be long. 300 words, 400 words, that's good. and bring it with, make sure you're including that you're a constituent and those types of stuff. Bring that with you and be prepared that you might have to leave it behind, because maybe you're going to show up at that office and nobody's going to be there. And if nobody's there, you take a picture of yourself with your testimony. Okay? Because that becomes something that you can post online and say, hey, I went and did this today, and this is why I was here, but my lawmaker wasn't, but I want you to know what I was going to say. The other thing that you can do is, especially if you've gone to an office and nobody was there, is make sure that your local press gets a copy of what you wanted to say to your lawmaker and the picture that you sent. If there are a lot of people that are sharing with the local press, hey, I was trying to get in touch. I know they're in district this week. I've been unable to figure out where they are, and I stopped by their office. They weren't there, but what I have to say is really important, and here's what it is. They get a lot of folks that do that. It becomes a way for the local press to start thinking about, these are issues that are really important to our local community. Maybe they do some coverage of it, and maybe it plants the seed that they need to keep doing coverage of Medicaid, because it keeps being an issue, okay? There's a lot of great stuff that came out this past week to share. Not going to go through it all, but you will get in your after meeting notes links to all of these articles. These are statewide pieces. There are lots of you who have shared that you've gotten a lot of local press coverage, and sometimes that's harder for us to find. So just be aware that, you know, all of those local press coverages, they're really important, because they all become things to share with your networks, okay? So these are statewide pieces. There's also some national pieces that are coming out. Again, different aspects of how Medicaid cuts would impact places. This one this week was focused on how Medicaid cuts will hurt rural areas more than some other places. So these are all become part of the Petri dish, the mix of things that you can help others understand by constantly, you know, making sure that you are sharing these items. And I think I'm going to conclude on this slide. Just again, you're the Medicaid experts, not lawmakers. They're making decisions about Medicaid that directly affect you, but most of them are not people who are in Medicaid right now. They might be in the future, but they're not right now. They can make these decisions, and it won't necessarily change their lives. They can make those decisions, and it will change your life. You're the expert by experience, by profession, because you're paying attention. And I need you to understand that people with disabilities are the leaders here. Everybody else is catching up, right? We need other people to join their voices, but it is the disability movement in this country that has made Medicaid this issue. And you should take some pride in that. Because, you know, in theory, there should be a lot of other voices that you would expect to be the leaders when it comes to a major part of our federal budget that supports so much of state and local economies and our healthcare infrastructure. But no, it's people with disabilities, and it's your stories, and it's you being constant that has made this the issue that it is. Other people got to catch up to you. And now you got to invite them in and egg them on and make sure that they're rolling with you. Okay? All right. I'm going to stop now. I know we're a little bit over time.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I do go on. Are there any questions that we can answer?
I think we got everything.